Thank you so much, AJ and Kaya, for sharing how critical this moment of opportunity can be for students. Can we give them another round of applause? I am Wallace, the Director of Engagement and Development at the Accelerator. While we set up for our next panel, take these 2 minutes to think about the progress that you have been making to increase access for students to high-impact tutoring. Turn to the person next to you and share your progress and learn about theirs. So you have 2 minutes, just turn and share. So I am thrilled to introduce Melanie Dukes, who is the Associate Program Director for K-9 Education for the Overdeck Family Foundation. Melanie has dedicated her career to supporting students most in need. Through her work leading education initiatives, building innovative programs, and using technology, data, and analytics to generate new solutions to complex problems. Melanie, thank you for being here today and moderating this panel.
Thank you, Wendy. Really excited to be here. I spend a lot of time in the funding world, and so it's nice to see all of you who are doing the work, and we're really excited to support this and have a forum for you. So on to our panelists. Each of these panelists are dedicated to educational equity and are deep in the work of providing high-impact tutoring for students. So our hope today is to be really honest with you guys about what are some wins, what are some challenges, what are some things that we are experiencing in the space, and hopeful tips that are actionable that you can take back to the day-to-day work that you do. So first, next to me is Philip Oreopoulos. Did I say that right? Great. He's an economist who currently serves as the Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Philip authored a recent influential meta-analysis on tutoring with Vincent Kwan of JPAL, who is here. I didn't say hi to you yet, but hi, Vincent. And with us also today is Vincent and others that did a terrific job of highlighting the potential of tutoring for addressing learning needs, particularly for students far behind grade levels. And he represents the researcher perspective, obviously, within this group. And then next we have AJ, who you guys already met. I don't think he needs an introduction, but his title, which I don't think we know, is Chief of Marketing and Communications and Vice Chair at Saga. And you all know very much what they do, but they specialize in scalable, personalized solutions, and he co-founded it in 2014. Next, we have Sharla Horton-Williams. She is the Senior Director of Academic Recovery at the Commit Partnership. They are a collective impact effort in Dallas County focused on building a collective education ecosystem that ensures economic opportunity is spread equitably. So she is the one that makes everything happen with each of the individual people. And then last but not least is Brittany Miller. She is the Senior Director of Expanded Academic Learning at Denver Public Schools. And Denver has implemented high-impact tutoring even before the pandemic. So Brittany's the OG on the district side. And she currently runs a number of high-impact tutoring efforts for the district. So thank you all for being here. Really excited for your collective brilliance. And we will start with Phil. And just as a heads up, we're going to go one by one, and then we have a few questions at the end, and we'll open it up for Q&A for each of you. So starting with you, Philip. And then just a heads up, I know we're all passionate about this, but maybe just 2 to 5 minutes on each question. I will try not to interrupt you, but we'll try to, if we can, get through this. I'd like to just start at the beginning, and maybe you can frame for us the research around tutoring. We all know that tutoring overall is great, but like what features of tutoring make them effective from a research perspective?
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie. It's really great to be here. As you mentioned, one of my roles as co-chair in education at JPAL was to put together reviews on what we know. And a few years ago, Vincent and I and Andre Mikhail got together and said, let's look at tutoring. And we gathered all of the randomized controlled trials in the last 40 years. There were about 100 of them. We started kind of taking a closer look. More than 80 of them were significant, with an average treatment effect of 0.4 standard deviations, which meant about 8 months of learning on average was seen as improvement from these programs. And any of you in education policy know that that's about as much consensus as you're ever going to get for a program pointing to this is something really worthwhile doing more of. And so that's something really worth exciting, that kind of off-the-charts, meaningful thing that we could be doing of. And there were some nuances, there were some things that AJ talked about where the programs were more effective if they were done in school than after school. They were more effective if they were done 3 to 5 days instead of less. We saw reading tutoring programs more effective at younger grades and math more effective at older grades. But in general, the programs all showed consistently quite striking promise, to the point where one might argue we might not really need another study to show tutoring is a good thing, to want more of it to happen. There's lots of nuances around that. There's still things that we don't know. I think we don't really understand what is the right dosage, whether we need to keep continuing tutoring past more than a year. Obviously, cost effectiveness is really important, and how to make sure that tutoring can happen in a more scalable ways, sort of a key thing that we're going to be discussing. The role of technology is really important as well in trying to understand how we can take advantage of new developments in terms of leveraging that and lowering costs. But on a whole, it's generally a good news story that all the things that we could be doing, especially helping right now with learning loss, tutoring is sort of front and center of things that we should do.
Thank you so much. One of the things I think Gates and Ed Solutions did a research project, and they found 2 types of tutoring models are emerging. One is this in-school model, which there's for-profit, nonprofit, district people leading up, and the other is this on-demand, which has a real potential in terms of cost effectiveness and scale. So curious from your perspective how these 2 models differ, what have you seen in research, and then what different types of groups do they serve? Because I'm really struggling with, do we need both? Are there benefits? Maybe talk to us a little bit about that and your perspective.
Sure. The on-demand type of tutoring, I think, is really fascinating, to the potential of scaling it on a massive level. We've seen some of that with Solcom's Schoolhouse World. I think that the potential for that has not been well researched yet. But one thing that is come clear is that even trying to set up the research or taking a look at what it is, it doesn't reach all the people that you're hoping to reach. It's rather than if you build it, it will come. It's sort of the opposite, where it's just, even if it's available and free and 24/7, not a very large fraction of people we'd like to be using it, use it. And so one clear thing that AJ also mentioned is that we really need to have tutoring done in a more structured way to make sure that we have as many people that we're trying to help actually receive it. And the potential issue on the demand is that the people we're trying to help actually don't access it. Maybe there's a way to think more about how to make sure that the large number of students we're trying to help can take advantage of that technology. Right now, from what we're seeing, finding more ways to get this done in school or during after-school programs seem more promising than leaving it up to tutoring to her own.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And it's helpful to have this research to guide us, so thank you for that. I'm going to switch over to the provider, AJ, to you. It's a little bit overwhelming. Tutoring is changing day to day. There's new information coming out, it's a new provider. Can you just, how do you get started? What are some tips if someone is looking to get started? Is this really worth all the change? There's schedule change, is it worth it? And then we've already heard personally a little bit about your tutoring, but maybe professionally, if you can talk to us about what have you seen at Saga to kind of answer those 2 questions as well.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I think one of the things that's really exciting about high-impact tutoring is that not only is it a great tool to help accelerate student learning, but it also can be a really great tool for human capital, like cultivating and nurturing the next generation of great teachers. And so as I think about districts starting to integrate this type of approach into how they operate, thinking about it from the value add it can bring from not only an academic perspective, but a human capital perspective, a mentorship perspective, and also a parent communication perspective, right? Because at Saga, our tutors communicate with families regularly. I remember the joy on my mother's face getting a phone call from my tutor saying, well, maybe I didn't do my homework, but also about the things I'm doing well in school and how meaningful that was for her. So from a district perspective, I think what's important is thinking about this as an investment and taking it from buckets, multiple buckets of funding streams from how districts spend in terms of engaging families and youth. So I think that's really important as well. The other part of your question is about some of the practical action steps. The practical action steps. I think part of it is, at Saga and Berg, there's a suite of guidelines in terms of like the hallmarks that lead to success. But I think districts will, first of all, I think one thing is like, at Saga, we believe districts ought to take this on. This should be part of how they operate. That's one thing. And then the other piece is that if you work alongside partners who've done this, like Saga, you'll be able to come up a learning curve at a much faster rate in terms of implementation with the right supports in place. I mean, districts, you're expert educators. To me, it's strange that tutoring has existed outside the ecosystem of education, and it's thinking differently, like this should just be part of how we operate. The first year is going to be challenging. I think that's important to know. Even Saga, the first year, partnering in any city is very challenging, but staying committed to it and sticking to it and making the right modifications will be important for long-term success. And even thinking about our work in Chicago, I mean, the first year of the study, it was like a point, like I said, 0.13 standard deviation effect size, and then the second year, it was a 0.37 standard deviation effect size. So, and one of the reasons why we just got to know the district, we got to know the kids, we got to understand the scheduling and overcoming some of those challenges.
Perfect, so it is worth it. And you said the first year is challenging. Tell us about some of the struggles that you're seeing during that first year, and are there things that this group could do to kind of get up that learning curve a little bit earlier?
Yeah, the biggest thing is just the sourcing of tutors. Like to implement any effective tutoring program, you just have to have the tutors on hand. So I think from a district's perspective, thinking about what I call a not yet approach. I mean, districts are getting all kinds of applications for teaching jobs. Not all of them make the cut. Some of them don't make the cut, maybe because they're not certified to teach. So maybe instead of a no, we take a not yet approach. Like, you're not qualified right now, but I see so much potential and promise in you. I'm going to ask you to become a tutor with us. And guess what? I'll pay you to be part of this for a semester, take you where you are, bring you where I want you to be, maybe an entire school year. So I think that's one pathway that schools and districts can take to mitigate against the human capital challenge. And the other piece is the potential for online instruction. When you're not constrained by geography, you dramatically open the pool of people who you can qualify to do this. Naturally, at Saga, we're very skeptical of online instruction. However, we're very excited about the potential and promise, and there's lots of opportunities to develop an approach that where relationships are at the center of it to help students thrive academically. So I think the human capital piece is important. So that requires a district to start to invest heavily in their HR infrastructure to provide those kind of pathways. It requires a district to collaborate effectively with the State Department of Education on alternative teacher certification guidelines and things like that. So it requires support from a policy perspective, an investment perspective, and also an implementation perspective.
Perfect. Thank you so much, AJ. So we're going to shift over to the people that are on the ground making it happen, both Brittany and Sharla, and hopefully they agree with what the two of you said in theory. So Brittany, we'll start with you. Denver is launching this work. Just to kind of ground us, can you talk to us about Denver's goal with the program, where you guys are in implementation, so that we can better understand kind of your motivations for doing this and where you guys are now.
Yeah, thanks so much. So Denver Public Schools, we serve just around 90,000 students. It's fluctuated a little bit with the pandemic. And last spring, we launched some design groups once we found out about the ESSER funding to determine how are we going to come back to school in the 21-22 school year, and how will we really support students to accelerate their learning as they kind of come back into the normal swing of things. Although there is no true normal, we all know that at this point. But regardless, a part of that design group work was to identify what were the strategies kind of beyond the instructional core that we would employ in order to support students. And so one of those strategies was our tutoring work. And so based on the recommendations that we got from educators in those design groups, we developed our tutoring model for here in Denver. And so our goal across the next 3 years is to serve 5,000 students with our tutoring efforts for a minimum of 36 hours of tutoring. We require, kind of to the hallmarks that everybody's talked about, the tutoring to occur between 3 and 5 times a week, to occur ideally during the school day or immediately after school if the school cannot make it happen during the school day. And then our other big goal around this is that we make sure that we're over-serving students that are intended to be served by our ESSER dollars. So that's our students of color, our multilingual learners, students with an IEP, and then students experiencing poverty. And then from an outcome perspective, we have an outcomes-based contract, which I think you'll probably hear a little bit more about later today, where the vendor is only paid 40 or 60% rather of their base payment for delivering services, and then the additional 40% is contingent upon the student outcomes being met. And so those outcomes come in the form of both academic outcomes, so we expect students to grow a year in their content area, either K-3 early literacy or 4th through 12th grade mathematics. And then we also expect that from a social emotional learning perspective, that students report at least 80% positive on survey questions that they take related to efficacy in their core mathematics instruction, and then student identity as a mathematician, since we know that those are two really big areas. And then, of course, at the early literacy level, we still track those, but we can't actually contract for those outcomes because kinder through 3rd grade students aren't quite as discerning with their feedback. So those are our overall outcomes that we're striving toward. And then from a perspective of where we are right now, so by the end of this year, we'll have served about 1,500 students across the different programs. The early literacy work, we were intending for it to occur by teachers leading the program, and so that was what our design groups in the spring told us. And then when we got into the 21-22 school year, what we found was that teachers had a lot on their plates still. This was not a normal year. And so while we do have about 250 students that receive tutoring from a teacher in a teacher-led program, it just wasn't serving enough students. And so we ended up going out to contract for an external vendor for the K-3 early literacy work. And so that was a later start in this spring, whereas the 4th through 12th grade math we've been doing since October. Our attendance rates have been anywhere from 60 to 80% depending on the grade level. In order for us to contract for that outcome, students have to attend a minimum of 70% of sessions, and so some schools are falling well below that average, particularly at the secondary level, whereas the majority of our K through 8th grade students are well above that 70% threshold, more in the 80s and 90s. And then from a satisfaction perspective, the most recent data that we had from the surveys that we give to students, we have students reporting between 80 and 90% satisfaction with the tutoring efforts in terms of those outcomes that I was speaking about earlier.
That is impressive. I'm going to go off script just a little bit, so hopefully this is okay, but it sounds like you guys are doing a lot. There's outcomes-based tutoring there, there's external in there. I'm curious about how you all decided to make those decisions. So very actionable, why did you decide to go certain paths? What were the needs that you guys were trying to solve? So it can maybe make it more actionable for how people can think about how to build their own tutoring program.
Yeah, I'll try to answer your question. If I don't get it, then feel free to follow up.
It's really around maybe just how can people think about getting to where you are in terms of the tutoring that they're providing for their students, if that's easier.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So from my former background, I'm like truly obsessed with data. My whole department and all the people that I work with know that. And so the decisions that we've been making are very data-driven, and so like my advice would be just start with what the data is telling you about what you need. And when I say that, I mean, of course, the outcome data and what you see kind of from a quantitative perspective about student needs, but also like from a qualitative perspective. What are the people that are being supported by this telling you? And that's where we started and where I grounded our goals, is that we started with asking our educators, our central office staff, our communities, our school leaders, our teachers, our students, what was it that was going to make the biggest impact for them when it came to this tutoring work? And that's really where we grounded the decision. And then we've been doing ongoing feedback loops with all of those different groups to inform any shifts that we're making to the programming along the way, and making those decisions more as like a holistic decision instead of it being kind of just based on one data point or one person's feedback or opinion.
I love that. I'm glad I asked. Just a quick chance for you to brag before we move on. Can you tell us about maybe some successes, and then maybe you agree with Alan, maybe you don't on the barriers of staffing, but maybe talk to us about some of the barriers that you face too, if it can help accelerate the work in the room.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say from a success perspective, really happy with the size and scope that we've been able to reach in this initial year. As we all know, every single day that students are in classrooms and they're struggling with their learning is a day lost for that kid, and they don't get that back. And so while it hasn't been perfect and we haven't had 100% attendance and 100% satisfaction across the board, just like finding a place to start and reaching as many students as we can is just super important because of that additional relationship like AJ talked about, and then also just their ability to then feel really proud of the work that they're doing in class. We also received a significant amount of funding from the state of Colorado to continue these efforts, and so that was a really important success as well, so that we're able to really scale and like not have to turn down anybody that wants this for their school or their students, so that's been a really important factor too. And then I would say from the kind of just like overall programmatic perspective, this year it really has felt like we've laid that foundation of how this can function within our different schools and district, and learned a lot along the way, and made a lot of smaller scale pivots that will then take into kind of larger pivots as we move into school year 22-23, which has just been really important for us to get this effort off the ground and then continue to support students. I would say from the outcomes that I discussed, that has enabled us to really engage in that continuous improvement work, and overall it's allowed us to drive toward better outcomes for students. And then we also conducted a lot of empathy interviews in like January and February. I think we did about 80 as a team across the, at the time we were only doing the mathematics, so 4th through 12th grade levels. And that was a huge success because we heard from students directly beyond just what they were submitting in the survey, like exactly how this was impacting them in the core instruction. And so that qualitative data was really helpful in terms of understanding like what could change about a student's experience as a result of participating in this. And so we did have students say, like, I didn't know that I could participate in my core maths class. Like, I didn't know that that was a thing I could do. And now, because of the small group instruction and the multiple opportunities to try, they feel more able to participate, which is just obviously exactly what we all want to hear as educators. From a barriers perspective, the logistics, I think, have been really challenging, as we've been talking about, just to figure out a way to make it happen during the school day. So when can it happen during the day? Who's supervising the students during that time if they're online? Where do the small groups meet? If it's an in-person tutor, like those sorts of logistics were significantly more challenging for our schools to set up than we had anticipated, and that's some of the feedback that we've taken into next year. And then the other piece of it is the teacher buy-in. And so I think we invested a lot in buy-in from leaders and making sure that leaders really understood the efforts in order to sign up. But because teachers actually know what is happening on the day-to-day with the instruction, it's really important that we spend more time as we move into next year really investing in teachers and finding ways that teachers and tutors can collaborate more effectively together so that they can make those micro adjustments to what's happening in core instruction into the tutoring program, and so that students are experiencing different content in each of those.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Can I give Colorado some love and another shout out? Colorado is actually the first state, from my understanding, has passed bipartisan legislation outlining the hallmarks for high-impact tutoring, steering state fundings to districts that are interested in implementing this work. So as I think about sustainability, Colorado's certainly been a pioneer in that space, and it's really exciting that Saga is able to play a role in supporting that work. I also think from a sustainability perspective, thinking about the U.S. Department of Education continuing to grant permission to allocate ESSER dollars, Title I dollars for high-impact tutoring, and even going beyond that, congressional appropriations recommendation to steer funds for high-impact tutoring too. So a big shout out to Colorado for that work.
I agree, and I also, one of my reflections was how you all keep students at the center of it and continue to improve in your work, which is something I think a lot of people aren't talking about right now because it's so new. So it's really, really helpful to hear and see that. Okay, so Sharla, to the woman who brings all of these people together, specifically in Dallas, would love to just hear, what is it that Commit does? My assumption is the work that you all do actually can help accelerate tutoring in a lot of different ways, so would be curious to hear from you what that looks like, specifically for the Dallas region.
Yeah, we are unique in that we're not a direct service provider, we're not a curriculum company, we're not a district, but we really sit in the center of all those folks, plus all the various sectors of our local community. So we're a convener, and we bring together partner districts, higher ed, faith-based communities. We pretty much bring together everyone to talk about the problem of learning disruption, the promise of high-impact tutoring, and help do all the necessary troubleshooting and sense-making to help districts figure out a path forward, but then also to help everybody else figure out what role they can play in that path forward.
That's perfect. And so there are some districts that do this, so I know DC is doing some form of this too. What is the unique difference that you all have seen from potentially a district that has someone like you or Commit versus someone doesn't? Like, how can you guys really accelerate the work, specifically the things that you guys do? I know you bring people together, but maybe just actionable. What are some things that you've seen?
Yeah, I think that one of the things is, as a convener, as a community organization, we've had to stop, because we had some really ambitious goals in the beginning. We're gonna help districts implement high-impact tutoring for hundreds of thousands of kids, and that goal was indeed ambitious, because for all intents and purposes, the groundwork had to be laid, and I think we underestimated what that groundwork was. So that step back was really important for two reasons. Number one, it helped us to really refine the work that we're doing with districts. It helped to bring us some clarity. But then number two, we had to answer the question, what is it that Commit does better than anybody else in our region, and how can that thing accelerate the work of high-impact tutoring? And for us, that's a couple of things. Number one, we sit in the seat of influence in our district, in our region. People listen to Commit because we've got long-standing deep relationships. We've got a history of making things happen, both in our region and across the state. So number one, really understanding our influence in our region. And then number two, a lot of our work is rooted in data analysis and visualization and using data to tell a compelling story about what's happening in education, both locally and then more broadly across our state. And while I think lots of people love data, and I think lots of people, districts have really robust data departments, what we don't always do is use that data to tell the compelling story to inform change. And so that's another pretty significant role that we've identified that we can play in this space. And then last but not least is, going back to that influence piece, is local and state advocacy. Because right now, districts have a lot of money to do the work, but we're not always gonna have the money available that we have now. So how do we, right now, while we have this, also do the background work of ensuring that local and state policy is aligned to really ensure the enabling conditions for this to be sustained long term. So we have lots of vendors that we have access to, lots of programs that we have access to, but one day that may not be the case. And so what are we doing on the ground right now, both in our board policy, our state policy, to ensure that post-ESSER funding, high-impact tutoring can continue to be the intervention that we turn to support student learning.
So clear, and thank you. I feel like this represents one of my favorite words right now, which is coherence, in terms of the role that you guys play. And just last question for you before I get into some more juicy questions for the panel. What's some early progress that you are excited about that's happening right now with Commit and in your district?
I think the thing that I'm most excited about right now is, in the beginning, we're unique in that in Texas we have state legislation that mandated that every student who was not successful, who didn't meet grade level proficiency on their state exams, had to receive 30 hours of mandatory tutoring in the subjects that they were not successful in. So that's significant. And while, you know, I feel like in some ways House Bill 4545 has been both a blessing and a curse, you know, it is the reality in Texas. In the beginning, lots of our conversation was centered around this legislation. It was all meeting the mandate, meeting the mandate, meeting the mandate. A year into this, I think some of the most significant progress is that we've shifted from an or conversation to an and conversation. It's not House Bill 4545 or high impact tutoring, it's high impact tutoring as a way to meet the mandate of House Bill 4545. And that's really significant because when you think about just the operational burden of high impact tutoring, what that means for a district to really be able to make that mental shift from meeting a mandate to doing what's right for kids, like that's really, really significant. So we're starting to hear as we engage with people at every single level, superintendents, assistant superintendents, deputy superintendents, and then in other sectors, you know, higher education provosts, you know, we're starting to hear this commitment that has started with a shared understanding and people at every single level having the same conversation about high impact tutoring.
I love it. I think what I hear from both of you guys is a lot of org change that doesn't necessarily get talked about a lot, but is key to implementation and success. So I love that you highlighted that. So I'm gonna move into a little bit of a fun question for the panel. I'm not gonna, anyone who wants to start, but I love each of your perspectives. 5 years from now, what does tutoring look like? And if there's some skepticism in there, would love to hear that too, but what does it look like? Is it around still? What is the would love to hear your perspective on that.
I'd love to start there. I think, you know, Nick Erber is standing in the back of the room, and Nick says, he's one of our district partners, and he says, you can't tier 2 yourself out of a tier 1 problem. And I love that because, to answer your question, is it still here? I really hope that we tutor ourselves, high impact tutor ourselves out of work. I really hope that in 5 years, we don't need high impact tutoring at the scale that we need it right now. And I think that if we do this right, if we seize this moment, we have an opportunity to take what we're learning, some of the best practices in high impact tutoring, and those will have a positive impact on tier 1 instruction. And the scale that we're seeing right now, the problem, the depth of the problem is significantly diminished. To that end, you know, leading up to that dream situation, I think that high impact tutoring has got to become institutionalized. It's got to become part of the way we do school. And I heard someone say that earlier, you know, we've got to completely reimagine the way we see this. And when we talk about tutoring, when we say the word tutoring, we mean high impact tutoring. That we're really redefining tutoring, the term and the programming, right? That we're not talking about meet me after school with your teacher and we'll sit for 30 minutes and make up your test. That we really have deeply ingrained, you know, across the education ecosystem, like that high impact tutoring, what it is, and that it's just part of the way we do school every single day.
I can build on what you were sharing, because I think I was like over here snapping up here when she was talking about Tier 1 instruction, because that's one of the things that we really stay very grounded in as we're rolling this out to different stakeholders. Is you can have the very best tutors in the world. If there isn't strong instruction happening in the core, then like you're only going to get so far, right? And so this is a way to improve what's happening in the core, both for students and for educators, if they can learn a thing or two about like how to better address differentiated in practice in the classroom. And I think my vision, or what I would hope for, wouldn't realistically necessarily be that we wouldn't need it at all, but instead I was like playing this mental game with one of my colleagues who's here today. I was saying like, what if in 5-10 years, whatever it is a part of the infrastructure, and we're able to get to a point where we're not in this place that we've all spoken about, where there's just such a great need and so much learning recovery as a result of the pandemic, or inequities before the pandemic, et cetera, but that we could think about like when content is most challenging for students at a particular grade level in a particular content area. And like as educators, we know that, right? Students are going to struggle with fractions a little bit. It's just something that's going to happen because it's a pretty conceptually difficult thing to figure out, right? Like I still struggle with fractions. And so if we can target those moments in instruction when we know that there's going to be an additional need, how might we shift human capital through kind of these foundations of high impact tutoring that we put in place to say, for this 6-week period, we're going to allocate all of our tutors to this grade level and make sure that students that are struggling with these concepts get these additional at-bats, these additional conceptual understandings and mini lessons to really address that area. And then we can shift that human capital more effectively and sustainably to the areas within a school or a school ecosystem where it's most needed. And then I think the other piece of that feels like really interesting and exciting to me is, in our current model, like we've always had interventionists in schools, right? Call them whatever you want to call them. And the way that I've always seen it work is more based on the student and what an individual student needs. And while I think that that's obviously a really important intention and that relationship is important, what it can do is it can then make the blame of mislearning fall onto the student. Whereas if we were planning from a content perspective and then students within that content area or time and place were able to receive that differentiated instruction and that high impact tutoring, then how might that enable us to kind of get away from this scenario where it's always the same 5 kids that need remediation and intervention, and then they just feel like the lost kid out, right? But instead it's focused on kind of this more flexible model based on the content.
So maybe I'll just add an echo on some of that. I think there's a growing realization on the need for more personalized learning and a recognition that students are learning at different paces. There's this constant tension between trying to accommodate everyone in the same class and recognizing that students need more time. Some students need more time to master earlier material, but at the same time, some students doing well need to be given an opportunity to, to move along. I think in terms of what this all might look like in 5 years, what it could look like is that if there's more recognition of the need for personalized learning time, it would be great to see schools be more systematic about it, and to carve out time, even if it meant substituting away from other curriculums, so that this emphasis on allowing students to work at their own pace, develop at their own time, especially on key areas like early reading and later math, would give some potential for all students to not play that catch-up game, because once they miss out on a few foundational materials, then it's always frustrating, and giving them the space to progress more at their own speed, I think, would be really important. The biggest issue, like sort of the elephant in the room, is cost, and I think trying to figure out how to address cost and do this on a massive scale so that the personalized learning or tutoring occurs at high enough dosage to make, a transformative difference is the biggest challenge. And, I don't think that's an easy problem to address. I think that it is real and it needs to be thought through carefully, but that's why we're here.
Before you go, AJ, I just want to say that I'm going to open it up after this. We've done enough talking. We want to hear from you. So just, if you do have questions, preparing you before AJ talks to ask them.
Yeah, I disagree with, I agree with everyone. Oh, I should be very provocative. I disagree with everyone. Let me tell you a news story. No, I think it needs to be part of the fabric of how districts operate. And I think cost is a big one. And I think central to that is recognizing that high-impact tutoring is not just a way to help accelerate student learning, but there are these other important ancillary benefits that go along with it that make it also worth the investment. And so the key question is like whether you can make a compelling enough case for a district to make a move like that. Identifying a cost that is under $1,000 per student that's sustainable and effective as well is also going to be important within the next 5 years. And then from Saga's perspective, as we think about the scale of high-impact tutoring, from our perspective, you don't have to provide a tutor for every single student at every grade level. I think we have to figure out a way to provide really intensive, targeted instructional support through high-impact tutoring at critical growth years, which our perspective is 3rd grade literacy and 9th grade mathematics, where you can see this 4x effect, right? If you pass, Algebra 1, you're 4 times more likely to earn a high school diploma. Similarly, if you are fluent in reading by 3rd grade, you're much more likely to earn a high school diploma. So that's one way in which you can approach this scale. And I think within the next 3 to 5 years, we need to have additional proof of concept similar to Denver, where districts are just operating this on their own, using a stream of different types of funding sources. And if you think about this nationally, as Alan is the Spock of Saga, you can do the math pretty quickly. If you think about all the students who are in 3rd grade and 9th grade in the United States, about 9 million students, right? And then if you think about maybe taking maybe a third of those students, so maybe a third of those students, maybe like 3 million students who would really benefit the most from high-impact tutoring, and then providing that support as a ramp-up. Seems like the sustainable way nationally to approach scaling high-impact tutoring. If you're talking about 3 million kids, you're talking about maybe 100,000 tutors you need nationally. So to have a national call for 100,000 tutors by the the United States, I think is something that's actually feasible. You're talking about maybe a $3 billion investment to create sustainable, long-lasting outcomes for youth. That is something we can rally around, everyone here, to make quite a compelling case for something like that.
Love it. I will turn it over and see if there are any questions. You've got almost every person represented in the tutoring space here, which I think is unique. So if you have questions, please let us know. I also have tons of questions that I can do, but I want to turn it over to you guys. Yeah? Do you want to stand up and say your name and shout your question as well? I think someone's coming over with the microphone as well, if that's helpful.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Kraft. I am a professor here at Brown. This is such an inspiring conference, and thank you, panelists. Building on this question of what this might look like in 5 years, of course, this is not the first time as a nation we've tried to scale tutoring. We can look back to the initiatives under President Clinton with America Reads and via No Child Left Behind, but supplemental educational services. I'm curious what we need to do differently to have this be a sustained initiative rather than those prior attempts, which I think were equally ambitious and grandiose, but ultimately weren't sustained at scale.
I can start. From my perspective, Commit, like I said, we work between sectors, all sectors of society, and I think one of the things that we have done wrong in education is we hold really tightly, like we hold the key. In district and campus and systems leaders, we haven't been very welcoming to the broader society. We haven't created meaningful opportunities to engage people outside of education in the work that we're doing inside of our schools and districts. And I think that one of the, and here we are, and I think that, to some degree, I can look at industry and say, like I just had this conversation with some industry leaders a few weeks ago, like, I love the idea that y'all are gonna come and plant flowers, but that is not gonna change outcomes for kids. So we've all gotta think radically differently about the role that we play in the work, and then we've all gotta come together and figure out how do we create space for everyone in the work. So when I look at high impact tutoring, for example, like one of the conversations that I'm constantly having is to convince people outside of education that this is worth their investment too. This is not just an education investment, this is a societal investment. What does that investment look like for everyone? What does it mean for industry to invest in high impact tutoring? What does it mean for the faith-based community to invest in high impact tutoring? What does it mean for higher ed to invest in high impact tutoring? But more importantly, at the system, at the district and campus level, are we ready to allow, have we created conditions for those investments to actually take place?
And so let me just add on creating those conditions. I think that it is a really hard question to think about. I think that there has been lots of good intentions in the past, and this might be one of them, but maybe there's more potential now. I think that we're learning more about what works and how to scale it. I think there's a lot of research effort underway to try to understand under what conditions. If there's a process by which you can make it really easier to scale up, I think we're realizing that if you can take the key components of what you want to be done at the ground level and make it easy to follow, really facilitates a process to get the programs up and running that we think are worth doing, to get the high enough dosage to happen to make it easy to follow that, the more that principals and superintendents see others doing that successfully, the more it creates this sort of positive cycle, and you can see like it becomes sort of common culture.
I'll go, and then maybe you can, yeah, there you go, something like that. And then you can be like, yes, okay. I would say money, that's like the biggest thing to me, right? Because in previous episodes, at least in our district, like when we're saying, oh, we're gonna give every kid like a daily reading partner, they're volunteers or they're minimum wage. Our students that need the very most do not need volunteers, nor do they need people that make a minimum wage. They need the very, very best people in front of them doing this work. And so I think that to me is the key difference, is the people that are being employed by our vendors, they receive a substantial amount of money to do this, right? A lot of training, and if they're not making the mark, then we ask them to find somebody else to work with our students. And that to me is a very different scenario where we're really elevating the quality of experience for the child. And that I think we do need to sustain.
Yeah, and to answer your question, Matt, you're a researcher, so it's weird telling you this, but there's a large body of evidence that shows the hallmarks that lead to success. That's one thing that's different from the No Child Left Behind era. The other thing that's important, that's very different, is that this is a message of empowerment to schools and districts. Like, you can do this on your own. And so that's a different type of way of thinking about it that I think is important. And there's elements of accountability in the hallmarks that are also different from the No Child Left Behind era in terms of alignment with what teachers are doing in the classroom, making sure there's really intense training and ongoing professional development, being very intentional about that. So there are some important things that really distinguish the way we're thinking about and defining tutoring that's different from the way people historically think about tutoring, which is ad hoc, after school, disconnected, which is not what we're talking about, which I certainly think is a shift from some of the challenges we've had in the past.
Would love to do one more if possible. We have 5 minutes. Yes.
Kai spoke earlier, I think she was prophetic to say. Thank you. When Kaya spoke earlier, I think she was Michael Duffy from the Go Foundation. I think she was prophetic in talking about the need for a mind shift change, and that's what we're talking about in success in 5 years will look like that. I want to build on Matt's skepticism and talk to the providers, UAJ, Sharla, and Brittany, about the difficulties you've had in integrating into the school day and the very difficult trade-offs that need to be made with principals and with teachers about what goes when high-dosage tutoring comes into the daily schedule for a student, and how you work with school leaders to kind of shift in terms of their expectations about what school is and how high-dosage tutoring can be an important part of that. I'd be curious to hear practical sort of lessons learned from those experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, I think central to that is making sure there's buy-in from the principal. The principal and teachers must really believe that high-impact tutoring ought to be part of the portfolio of things they're doing to support kids. In the absence of that, it's very difficult to think about it. There's lots of interesting ways to think about schedule. There's matrix and putting students in tutorial. You can take a few minutes off of several periods, to create a new space. You can have a double block period of math, and you can use this to replace that. And there's also an effective use of an extended school day. It's not as if all tutoring happens at the end of the school day, but if you have an extended school day, then you're able to start to fold tutoring throughout the school day, just to name a few. But first it starts with that buy-in, and then if there's that buy-in, there are ways in which you can start to explore some options. It's much easier at the high school level. It is trickier at the earlier grades, right, or you have lots of block scheduling, and sometimes it could end up being a pull-out. And so I think part of it is thinking about, what is it that if this is a important part of it, then thinking about the scheduling district-wide that can free up this space, which is, it creates a series of crucial conversations about what's a priority for a district.
Yeah, from a kind of district perspective, that's exactly what we had to do. Is we had to work directly with our curriculum teams to make sure that as we were putting out scheduling guidance for next year, that we have a place where tutoring fits into the day. And so that it took crucial conversations even at the district level where, I'm talking with our director of humanities who's like, you're not taking any of my minutes for early literacy core instruction for tutoring, right? And it feels initially like that push-pull as opposed to well, we actually have to do both. So how do we come together and find that third way to make it happen? And then from there, yeah, it absolutely is an investment in buy-in at the teacher level. I would say it's a lot easier to do at the elementary and even K-8 level than it is at high school, just because of the way that high school is scheduled. And so we spent a lot of time working around scheduling guidance for high school and actually recommended an academic success block to just be a block of student stays minimally at the freshman level. And then with that, they could kind of flex into different opportunities that students could use for that academic success block, but then making sure that students receive credit for it, and it's not done as taking their free period or their lunch away, or their, off, additional electives that they want to participate in.
So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, and I shared earlier that Texas is unique in that we have this state legislation mandating these 30 hours of tutoring, and I'm going to share an example that I shared last night at dinner. When I taught the last course that I taught was 8th grade social studies. In Texas, there are 36 readiness standards and about 15 or so supporting standards. If I'm an 8th grade student who was not successful on SAR this year, I take 4 tests. I take reading, math, science, and social studies. If I was not successful on all 4 of those, if I didn't meet grade level proficiency on all 4 of those, I have to get 30 hours of mandatory tutoring in all 4 of those subjects. That's 120 hours that ideally is going to be held during the school day. And while I said earlier that House Bill 4545 is both a blessing and a curse, here's the curse in that. There just wasn't enough space for district and system level leaders to make the decisions that they need to that are relevant to their context, relevant to their schools, relevant to their... So here I am. I'm an 8th grade social studies teacher. I've got 36 readiness standards. I can't teach that to the depth and complexity for students to reach mastery in less than about 47 minutes a day, okay? But now we've got to add 120 hours of tutoring during the school day for students to get this additional support that they need. When? And so I say this to anyone who may be, anybody who's at the state level who may be considering similar legislation to House Bill 4545. Think very deeply about the how that accompanies the what. And so here we are, we're facing, like, number one, it's an unfunded mandate. Like, Texas did not allocate money to make this happen. But then number two, think very deeply about, like, what are the ripple effects? What are the implications of this mandate, of this legislation? And how can it be actualized on a campus, right? And so now what's happening is campus level leaders, district level leaders are deciding, do we support students in science or in math or in reading? Like, what do we do? Because we can't do it all. And so I think being very, very realistic. I'm on the transit board in my local city, and I just read an article about how people who make decisions about transit are not people that use transit. And I'm like, you're right, because I don't use transit. And I find the same to be true in public education. People who make decisions about public education are not always the ones who are closest, most proximate to the issues in public education. And so we have lots of opportunity, I think, to bring more folks to the table, to engage more people in the conversation, so that we can ensure that the reticence that we're hearing and that we're experiencing across these conversations is met with really reasonable and actionable standards and expectations, so that this can be both scalable and sustainable long term.
I just wanted to add on, because I really think that's a critical question. If we're going to incorporate tutoring more in school, we need to know how to make it easy to get it done. If you all have it just on one period, it makes it more difficult to have, you need more tutors, you spread it out, it screws up the scheduling. My experience watching teachers try to incorporate in schools into personalized learning time or independent learning time, which a lot of schools do, it becomes ad hoc. Some teachers do it well, some don't. There was just more guidance and more accepted best practices for how to incorporate in school. I think a lot of us could then follow that and have some recipe to make it easier to have.
Philip, AJ, Sharla, Brittany, thank you all so much for your insights, the work you're doing with kids, the best practices. I'm hoping everybody took at least something away. They're here the entire day, so feel free to continue the conversation. Sorry we can't continue to go on. So I'm gonna just pause and just ask, please, if you could give them a round of applause.